Call the Legislative Post Audit Committee to order December 12, 2022. Just want to remind everybody, we are live streaming, and make sure you turn on your mics when you're asking questions or talking. Please turn in your travel vouchers. Start off, I'm going to recognize Kristen on the consent calendar. Go ahead, Kristen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee. On today's consent calendar, there are 2 items. So just as a reminder that unless there is objection, the items on the consent calendar are considered approved by the Post Audit Committee. So the first item on the consent calendar is approval of the minutes from the last meeting, which was already September 14th, if you can believe it or not. And those are included in attachment A, which is in tab A. I should clarify. And then the second item on the consent calendar is not one that you see often, but is something that we do annually. So there is in state law the Kansas Governmental Accountability Law, or what's called KGOL, that requires us to at least designate at least 4 performance audits that we've already completed this year as meeting the intent of KGOL. So that includes things like whether or not programs meet public needs, are efficient, cost-effective, that sort of thing. So we as your staff have identified 4 performance audits that we completed this past year that we think meet the requirements of KGOL that we would suggest designating as such. That includes, the first one is the virtual school audit, which addresses things like how that function works in other states and potential efficiencies or cost savings, the availability, cost, and quality of centralized IT security services, which was the one that looked at the Kansas Information Security Office, meets the part of KGOL that talks about is the function still needed, is it responsive to needs, that sort of thing. The third audit is looking at the economic impact statements, and we think that that meets the requirement in KGOL that looks at would other structures work better. And then the foster care audit, which meets the KGOL requirement about things like, does the function still provide public benefit? Is it responsive to needs? That sort of thing. And that wraps up the consent calendar.
Questions? Not seeing any questions. Do we have anybody who'd like to abstain? Not seeing any. Do we have a motion to object? Not seeing any. The consent calendar is approved. We'll move on to our performance audits. Our 3-year IT security summary report. Alex, go ahead and start.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. So state law authorizes our office to conduct IT audits as directed by this committee. These audits are conducted on a 3-year cycle. This report summarizes results from individual entity audits to answer the question, do state and local entities adequately comply with significant IT security standards and practices? So the short answer is some do and some don't. I'll take you through kind of why this matters first, and then we'll talk a little bit about how the work was conducted before getting to the findings. So we start on page 4. Background, why does this matter? Why do we do these audits in the first place? Under established security standards, state and local entities must protect the sensitive information that they gather and work with against data loss and theft. Kansans use state agencies, services, and programs and depend on them to protect their personal information. Criminals know this and target government entities because of it. State and local entities have to balance their business needs against security risks, though. Most entities are not in the IT security business. They have other core missions like educating students or housing inmates or monitoring air quality. Implementing security controls also takes staff, can reduce staff speed and limit functionality. And also it takes time and resources to put these controls in place. Now, there have been several statewide initiatives aimed at improving the state's IT security as a whole. Among them, the creation of an executive council called ITEC, which establishes statewide security policies, and the 2018 Cybersecurity Act. So we covered the why. I want to go over now the how we've done the work, which starts on page 7. Our IT audits involve collecting a lot of information from state agencies and school districts about their IT security processes and controls. We evaluate selected IT processes and controls using a variety of means, including vulnerability scans, face-to-face interviews, on-site inspections, file reviews, social engineering, and other tests as needed. We create and provide confidential reports to the audited entities, and then present summaries of our findings to this committee and other legislative committees in closed hearings. Both the reports and hearings for individual entities are kept confidential under a provision of the Open Records Act because they contain detailed information about specific security weaknesses, and a release of that information could jeopardize the entity's IT security. However, in an effort to make sure that the lawmakers and the public get a sense for the work that we do and help hold the audited entities accountable, we have produced a public report like this one every so often. So between January of 2020 and December of this year, we conducted audits of 20 entities. Our work plan generally consisted of 40 to 50 control items across 9 different control areas. Most control items came from either state statute or ITech policy, and we did have a few best practices as well. For each control item, we awarded between 0 and 3 points based on an entity's compliance level. If an entity had taken some steps towards compliance but weren't all the way there, we awarded partial credit, 1 or 2 points, depending on how far along they were. Points were totaled for each control area and then converted to a percentage, as shown in Figure 1 on page 8. So that's what we did for the individual audits. For this report, we looked across all 21 reports and looked for commonalities in findings and root causes. One last thing to note is that one entity was audited twice during this time period, but for ease of understanding, we treated that as 2 separate entities throughout the report, which is why you'll hear reference to 21 entities. So the big finding is on page 8. Overall, 10 of the 21 entities audited over the past 3 years did not substantively comply with applicable IT security standards and best practices. So the 10 scored below a 50% and received an overall limited or very limited assurance rating. So translated to colors, that would be red or orange. Figure 2 on page 9 shows the number of findings, or kind of how those findings broke down across the control areas for all 21 audits. As the figure shows, a handful of areas had the most significant security weaknesses, those being vulnerability remediation, which is scanning and patching, security awareness training, and incident response and continuity of operations planning. At most entities, we also selected and reviewed a specific IT system that held or processed sensitive data, and that would be the system review there in the figure. Moving to page 10, the security findings summarized in this report are similar to those in previous summary reports. So even though our audit work varies from year to year, we consistently evaluate security areas that we think are most important and most fundamental to a basic security process. State agencies and school districts continue to have similar IT security issues to those we've identified in audits that we've conducted over the past 20 years. Several entities, were audited for the second or third time during the past 10 years or so. And then some entities improved from one audit to the next, while others had repeated findings. The primary reasons behind the compliance issues really came down to 2. Lack of proper management attention and oversight, and inadequate staff resources. So taking the first cause first, top management is ultimately responsible for an entity's IT governance, risk management, and compliance. Despite this, we often found that top management had not set sufficient expectations or monitored compliance with security standards. We also found several entities lacked a strong security culture based on repeated audit findings. So as far as the second cause, inadequate staff resources within IT can make it difficult to create or maintain a security baseline and retain institutional knowledge. Several entities had few to no IT security staff to carry out IT security work, even though those entities contained sensitive data. We also noted security resources were likely insufficient for several entities, given their size and federal compliance requirements. On the flip side, entities that invested in IT resources, including retaining experienced IT staff, generally had better security posture. I'm going to go over the highlights of a few of the most common areas next, starting on page 11. So first off, most entities did not adequately scan or patch their computers to keep them secure. Over time, holes are discovered in computer software that can allow someone to break in or harm an entity's network. To protect against this, entities must periodically scan for known vulnerabilities, and when found, must apply security fixes called patches to keep their computers secure. We found that many entities did not scan machines for issues or only performed partial scans. Most entities also did not patch their computers, meaning they did not apply fixes issued by the vendor to fix the holes in their software. We also found that most entities also had some levels of unsupported software. So what that means is normally a software vendor will supply security fixes and issue those to fix security issues that are found in the software. Over time, though, vendors stop releasing those security fixes for a number of reasons, whether it becomes too costly or they want people to move on to the newest and best version. Nevertheless, the security patches stop coming and the software becomes unsupported. Our scans frequently found unsupported versions of Microsoft and third-party products. Moving to page 12, more than half of the entities lacked adequate incident response and continuity of operations plans or did not appropriately test them. So an incident response plan lays out the steps to isolate, contain, and remedy a security incident. And a security incident can be anything from an inadvertent email with some personal information in it all the way to a dedicated hardcore ransomware attack. Continuity of operations plans, on the other hand, are meant to outline a strategy to remain operational and minimize downtime when dealing with a major disruption. So most of the time, the things that agencies will use those for have to do with major weather events like fire, flood, pandemic, things like that. We found that several entities did not have one or more of these plans, and some were not testing them to make sure they worked like they were supposed to. Next, on page 13, almost half the entities did not provide adequate security awareness training. We saw entities that didn't have a training program at all. We also saw entities that didn't train staff in security awareness consistently, or had a training program that was missing key required components. Many entities failed simulated phishing tests that were performed, and several entities did not secure or dispose of sensitive information properly. On pages 14 through 17, outline problems in the other areas that we looked at: account security, data protection, network boundary control, physical data center security, management, contract policy related things like that. While the problems were not as pervasive across the entities, findings in these areas were significant and at times surprising. Jumping to page 17, I wanted to explain our review of specific IT systems. So at each entity, we audited a specific IT system that held sensitive data. And for each system, we looked at a limited number of controls just on that system. Overall, we found that significant security issues in many systems with respect to account security, data protection, scanning and patching, and risk and security assessments. We did not make any recommendations for this summary audit. I'm on page 19 now. Each audited entity received recommendations in their individualized audit to fix the identified issues, and based on initial responses, entities generally plan to fix most of the findings. That concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Do we have questions? Representative Barker?
Thank you, Alec. Good presentation.
Is your mic on? There you go.
Lights
Pull
on.
it closer.
Blue light's on, so okay. Okay. You know, we do these every couple of years. Are we making some improvement? I mean, I just remember Capers does an excellent job with their IT security. At least that's what their reports were from the last time we looked at them. But overall, the state, it doesn't seem like we're making any progress. Would that be a correct statement?
It's hard to say, Representative, as far as holistically. We are seeing kind of incremental progress at individual entities. The report mentioned, some entities kind of progressed and remedied findings while others continue to have issues for one reason or another.
I just think the legislature at some point in time needs to address this issue so we can see some improvement. Because wait till we get hacked and all of this sensitive information. I always worried when we did the IT audit on KU. It was not very revealing. Well, it was revealing that we need to do some areas, work on certain areas, but other departments within the state, you know, and I don't know if it's a leadership problem or if we just can't, sometimes they indicate we can't find the personnel with the expertise to hire. And if we do hire them, we don't pay them enough. So that was my statement. That's good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further questions? Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One quick question. How diverse are the software packages in these various agencies with regard to, you know, if you've got running a Windows 10 versus Windows 11 or still on 7, you know, or everything has different patches that are necessary to bring them up to speed. How diverse is that, and is that a problem?
Thank you, Senator. I don't know that I would characterize it as a problem necessarily. It does provide an extra challenge for entities that are using a variety of different software platforms or versions. Obviously, the more versions you have, the more different and the greater the number of software types, programs, et cetera. That just means you have to check for that one more thing. And so some entities, I know, were using more dated versions of whether it be operating systems that have long since been outdated, but they needed them for whatever business reason. In some cases, I believe mitigating steps were taken as far as either taking those machines off the network or making them not internet accessible, things like that. But yes, if you can think it, we probably saw it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Other questions, comments? My comment is, I mean, I've been on this committee a long time. We've seen a lot of audits on different agencies and entities. It seems like we're improving. For state, we're not probably where we need to be, but we're getting there. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, though. On sub-agencies, other agencies are doing incredibly good. So keep up the good work. Not seeing any further questions. We'll move on. Okay, economic development evaluation, Kristen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee. I am going to turn to a different document that was slid inside kind of the front cover of your binders that it has the word memorandum on it. So you have, I think, a couple in there. This one will have my name on it, and the subject is evaluating new economic development incentive programs created in 2021. So state law requires, this goes back a couple few years, that the legislature created a requirement for our office to regularly evaluate economic development incentives. And part of that same statute has a provision requiring us to evaluate all new economic development incentives the year after they begin. So that is what this is helping us to do. We did identify 4 incentives that the legislature created in 2021 that we think meet the definitions in state law. I would mention that because they are so new, there's very little data available to review. But having said that, we did touch on each of the statutorily required pieces to speak to them at least a little bit for these 4 incentives. So those items that are required in state law, you'll see under each incentive, there are sort of underlined words like description, statutory goals, history, et cetera. Those are the things that are required in state law. So I will touch mostly on fiscal and economic impacts today, but do feel free to read the rest, ask questions on anything that you have. So the first incentive that the legislature created was the Eisenhower Foundation tax credit. For that, taxpayers can claim a state income tax credit equal to 50% of their donations to the Eisenhower Foundation, which maintains a museum and preserves the legacy of President Eisenhower. That tax credit is available from tax year 2021 through 2025. So we looked at data for tax year 2021, and in that year, Kansas taxpayers earned just over $120,000 in tax credits. But as of the date we were doing this work, taxpayers had only used just over $1,000 of those tax credits. I would mention that those amounts aren't final because state law does give taxpayers up to 3 years to amend their tax returns. So moving on to the second newly created incentive, you'll see on kind of that second page there, backside of the first page, is the Friends of Cedar Crest Association tax credit. It is similar in many ways to the Eisenhower Foundation credit. So taxpayers can claim a state income tax credit that's equal to 50% of their donation to the Friends of Cedar Crest. That association helps preserve and promote kind of public awareness of Cedar Crest, the Kansas governor's residence. That tax credit is also available from tax years 2021 through 2025. If you move down to that economic and fiscal impacts section, you'll see that again in tax year 2021, taxpayers earned just in this case under $35,000 in tax credits, but to date had only used $350 of those credits. Again, taxpayers have up to 3 years to amend their tax returns, so those amounts aren't final. The third incentive program is the Qualified Charitable Distribution Credit. It is different than the others in that it is a tax credit against state income or privilege tax liabilities to what is called a technology-enabled fiduciary financial institution, also called a TEFI. TEFIs are a new type of asset management service provider that the legislature created in 2021. They provide fiduciary services for alternative assets that aren't publicly traded. So the amount of the tax credit that TEFIs can earn is equal to the value of qualified charitable donations that they make during a tax year. I would mention that at least for the time period we reviewed, that kind of the TEFI program was still in a pilot phase, so there was really only one TEFI that was operating in the state. There's no cost to the state at the moment because no tax credits were earned. Again, for the time period we reviewed. That is related very closely to the fourth and final newly created incentive, which you'll see there on the kind of second to last page back. That is the Technology-Enabled Fiduciary Financial Institutions Development and Expansion Fund. So I just mentioned that TEFIs have to make qualified charitable distributions. A portion of those distributions are credited to a TEFI Development and Expansion Fund that the Department of Commerce administers. And that fund is supposed to support economic development projects in what's called economic growth zones, which are basically like smaller, more rural communities. So moving to the economic and fiscal impacts section, as of the time we did this work, the kind of pilot program and that TEFI had distributed about $3 million to the TEFI fund. And Commerce told us that they were going to fund or use the funds from that to support a new program, which is called the Strategic Economic Expansion and Development Program, or SEED program, that would give grants of up to $50,000 to small rural communities. And with that, that actually wraps up the information that I have for you today. I would mention, I think that there are staff from Commerce and Revenue and the Office of State Bank Commissioner, Friends of Cedar Crest, if you have questions as well.
Do we have any questions? Okay, not seeing any for Kristen. Go ahead, Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One quick question. I was looking at 46-1137, the statute this works under. And so it's within the first year. Is there any follow-up? I was just scanning it real fast, like at year 3, year 5.
Yes, so once they're added to the sort of cycle, if you will, we're supposed to evaluate them. The language in statute is every 3 years thereafter, but is subject to resource constraints. So we're currently not covering all of them every 3 years, but this is kind of skipping ahead a little bit, but a preview that here upcoming on the agenda, you're also going to have an audit proposal in front of you that does actually include a follow-up on a couple of these incentives.
The
Thanks.
subcommittee met a couple of times, and we've kind of looked over all the credits and kind of tried to put a plan together to be able to hit them all as the most impacted we can. So, yeah, you're going to hear more of that. Are there further questions for Kristen? Not seeing any. Is there any questions for Commerce, Cedar Crest, or State Banking Commission on this issue? Doesn't look like we used much on the 2 tax credits at all. So, okay, we'll move on. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
That's partially a function of this law that requires us to evaluate them the very first year. So every time we present this to you, there probably won't be much activity on the ones we're evaluating because it's just their first year.
Right. No, I get it, but still, in the first year, there's going to be some that you use a lot, and I don't really see this as one that's going to get used too heavy, but year 3 or 4, more people will learn about it, and yeah. Okay, thank you. We'll go ahead and move on to legislative post-audit operation, statutory audit proposals. Kristen, go ahead.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chair. So moving right along, if I'm now going to flip to something that wasn't on the inside cover of your notebook, but is behind tab B. In there, you'll see there are actually 2 audit proposals in tab B. Both are related to K through 12 audits. So the first of those, and let me maybe back up here a second, but we're coming to you with these proposals today because both of them are required by state law, and they have due dates of January 15th of 2024. So we are looking for your approval today so that we can get them started and make sure that we have them done with plenty of time for that deadline to come around. So first, kind of looking at the first audit proposal that's in there, which is evaluating at-risk expenditures and statutory compliance. That addresses, it's for any of you who are interested, it's KSA 72-5173, and this is subsection H. So that requires a performance audit of at-risk education expenditures and several kind of components of that process. I would mention that in 2019, our office released an audit of at-risk funding that did find a few problems, things like at-risk funding being spent mostly on teachers and programs that serve all students rather than focusing on at-risk students. So this proposal would address, there's 3 questions, which you'll see on there. The first of those is, how do school districts spend their at-risk funding? And does that spending comply with state law? The second objective is, has the Department of Education and State Board of Education acted in accordance with state laws related to at-risk programs? And the third objective is, how have at-risk students performed on state assessments in the last several years? And I would mention that all 3 of those are specifically required in state law.
Okay. You want to take questions on that? Yeah.
Fine.
Do we have questions on the at-risk? Not seeing any. Do we have any online? No? Okay, go ahead. Do we need a motion on that, don't we? Representative Barker makes a motion. Do we have a second? Second by Representative Burrows. Any questions or comments? All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Against nay, it passes. Okay, go ahead and move on.
Okay, so the second is also a requirement in that same statute, but it's subsection F, that requires a performance audit to provide a reasonable estimate of the cost of providing educational opportunities for every public school student in Kansas to achieve the performance outcome standards adopted by the State Board of Education. So that is what you'll see in that second proposal. That's there. Again, it also has a statutory deadline of January 15th, 2024. This proposal includes 2 questions. The first is, what is the estimated cost to K through 12 school districts to educate all students to meet performance outcome standards set by the Board of Education? And the second objective is, what does research say about the relationship between spending and outcomes? So in this case, objective 1 is explicitly required by state law. We as staff added the second question thinking that that would provide useful information to you all as well.
Okay, do we have questions on the second proposal? Senator Corson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Have we done this audit before? Or is this the first time?
We have done an audit of the cost of education before. It was many years ago, so I'm looking at the crowd. Was it 2010? 2006?
Yep, that's
It's
right.
looking like 2006.
I'm just not envious of you having to do this because I think the question of what does adequate K-12 education cost is just inherently very subjective, and there are going to be a lot of different opinions on it. So I'm just sort of not envious of you of having to kind of weigh in on that. So, but thanks I'm sure you'll do great work on it.
Representative Barker, you have a comment?
Again, this is required by our legislature. They passed the bill. I was going to bring it up later, but, we're getting to the point where in every bill, the legislature is wanting post-audit to do something. Eventually, in April, when we decide our audits, we will have none to decide because all their time will be consumed doing these type of bills or these type of audits. We've done it before. Now we're going to do it again because it's in a bill that we passed. So I would imagine if we continue, and over the years, and I know my good friend over there has been here longer than me. I was in grade school when you got appointed to this. But I've been on it 10 years. And over the years, I have saw the number of audits that we could pick diminish because everybody that's got a bill and the legislature wants passed, they say, well, it makes it a little bit better if we audit it. And is this a one-time audit or is this going to be every 3 years?
This is a one-time audit.
Not a one-time audit? So that's another option that we do not have in April when we pick our audits. That was my only comment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I believe the last time we did this audit was '06 after the special session, after Montoy. And Senator, I think your side of the aisle appreciated the audit much more than my side did. But I'll just say it like that. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I tend to agree. I mean, looking at the breadth of even objective number 1, we're not going to learn anything from this, and we're not going to have anything actionable from this. Because I tend to agree. I think we ought to leave our powder dry for April. And this is, if we had something that was more tailored, and I'm not even sure it would give us the answers we're looking for, I tend to agree that this one might be something we delay or until a later date, until it can be more focused. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Burrows?
And thank you for that comment, Senator. I agree with the comments that have been made. I think we go back and look at the time frame that these audits were requested. It was a little bit different environment here in the legislature in reference to education and the amount of money it takes to educate the kids and state. So I'm with you, Senator. I kind of wonder why we want to do this and continue to come after the cost of education. Are we still under guidance of the courts in reference to, I would think that if we need some guidance, that we'll have that guidance as to what we may need to look at. So I would agree with Senator Thompson, my chairman.
Okay. Go ahead, Chris.
And just to sort of reiterate that point, years ago, there were several audits put in statute, at-risk, bilingual, transportation, special eds, and this is the end of the line. So they're old, they're not old, but they were approved many years ago. And the last two are at-risk and a cost study. Then that's the end of the statutory requirements.
Okay. Go ahead, Representative Burrows.
So, Mr. Chairman, I guess my question would be, it says we have to do this. Do you need a motion to postpone it? What action do you need from us to look at this? Or is there any action necessary?
Well, I think we need a motion to approve it, or that postpones it. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I'm not sure how to navigate since it's written in state law. I don't know if
Representative
revisor has
Barker?
thoughts.
I would have a question for the reviser. It is in legislation, state law. Does the committee have the authority to either disapprove it? I don't think so, but to delay it? For reconsideration?
So the statute 725173 provides that the language is the Legislative Post-Audit Committee shall direct the Division of Post-Audit to conduct the following performance audits. And then, of course, there's a list. And with respect to this particular one, the language is this performance audit with respect to this, let's see, which one is this? This is F. The language is shall be conducted during fiscal year 2024 and the final report submitted to the legislature on or before January 15, 2024. So, that's the language of the statute. And
Thank you. I just want that clarification. It means we're going to do it.
Yeah. Well, I'd hope so. I don't want to end up in trouble with anybody. Is there any other audits? Because, if we would have thought about this a year or two ago, we probably could have repealed this audit. Is there any other audits in the future that we might want to repeal or on a statutory timeline? It'd just be a good note to take a look at. Let's get back on the subject. Do I have a motion? Oh, wait. Okay, I'm sorry. Representative Williams, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So on this topic again, I just want to remind everyone that previous to these 5 audits that were education audits, we would audit school districts every year. And so that was, I think, up to maybe 3 every year. So then they were replaced by these that were subject area, and they have been very informative to education policy when we look at bilingual and when we look at risk, which was in 2018, and special education. And though this one is much larger in scope, we have school districts right now that are saying, even though we've fulfilled our Gannon responsibility, they're saying that, no, we haven't in special education. So I think it is helpful, and I'm glad that the committee decided to go ahead and stick with what the statute said, since we all voted on it. And I agree with Representative Barker. There are a lot more that have been added, and it's our job as legislators in each of our body to try to remove those things in debate whenever we can, but also remembering that some of them are extremely helpful to us. So I just wanted to throw that into the discussion. Thank you.
Representative Barker, you got a comment? Go ahead.
No, I'll make your motion.
Okay. Got a motion. Do I have a second? Second by Senator Corson. Any questions or comments? All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Oh, sorry, hang on. Representative Tarwater?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What is the motion that we're going to vote on?
Approve.
To approve.
Approve the, okay. All right. So I think this is important. Somebody said earlier that we're not going to learn anything from this, but we do have the high density at risk that is set to sunset in 2 years. And it's $72 million a year. And this would be good information to have when we make the decision on whether or not to extend that sunset. So thank you.
Okay. Further comments? Not seeing any. All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Against, nay. Passes. I remember the Montoy one. It was several hundred million they recommended to put in. Okay, we'll move on to economic development evaluation. Go ahead, Chris. Go ahead.
Okay, while I'm here, thank you, Chair and Committee. So this, Senator Thompson actually is kind of going to connect the dots for what we were just talking about a little bit ago. So again, state law, this is another statutory requirement that created this sort of responsibility for our office to review economic development incentives on a 3-year cycle. We are nearing the end of the first year cycle, so we're actually mostly finished with that work. We'll be presenting the final report to you all at the January meeting from that cycle. So we're coming back to you to kind of re-up, so to speak, to select the new incentives for the next 3-year cycle. And to do that, if you'll recall, a few months ago, you all created an economic development subcommittee. So that had 3 members on it, which is the chair, Representative Williams and Representative Burrows. And they participated in that subcommittee. They met twice to kind of go through all of the incentives that fit within the statutory definitions, and then to pare that list down to something that is a number of incentives that we think is feasible for us to review on that 3-year time horizon. So if you'll look at tab C and that audit proposal there, that is sort of the culmination of that subcommittee's work in proposal form. So the subcommittee selected 11 incentives. They're listed there in those bullets. So it includes the alternative fuel tax credit, aviation and aerospace tax credit, community service tax credit program, credit for taxes paid to another state. Here's where we would come back to the Eisenhower Foundation tax credit, the Friends of Cedar Crest tax credit, the Angel Investor tax credit, which is also one that we've reviewed. Rural Opportunity Zones would be a new one. Sales tax and revenue bonds is one that we have reviewed. Targeted Employment Act tax credit is new, and the Technical Community College tax credit would be new to us. So those 11 incentives, the subcommittee chose because many of them include a sunset date. So the thought was that they would like us to review those before they sunset. There are a few of them on there that don't have a sunset date, but that's because we had a little more room in our, we thought we had a little more room on our schedule to fit those in. I would mention that we will also have to review all newly created tax incentives per that statutory provision as well. So we know that for this next calendar year, there are quite a few. So I think we've counted 11 newly created incentives that we will need to say something about. So that is the proposal. The questions they're going to be very similar to what we reviewed Previously, so the objective as we've written it is what are the selected economic development incentives, estimated economic and fiscal impacts. It would include that and then the other things that are written in statute, such as a description of the program, its history and its goals, a literature review, a comparison to other states, all of those kind of component pieces. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, my comment before we start questions is, you know, there's like Starbond, you don't sit on it because we just reviewed it. You don't need to review it every year. Go ahead, Senator Thompson.
I just, with regard to the newly created, would that be, Apex be included in that?
It is one of them that's in
Okay.
there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Barker.
I was looking on the last page, estimated resources. You have 3 auditors, but you don't have a time period.
So this would cover, it's a good question, I should have mentioned as much, but this will cover a 3-year time period. So it would be calendar years 2023 through 2025, and we would sort of split these up to fill that 3-year period.
Thank you.
Other questions? Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would it be, it seems like when we have a new incentive program and then you audit it that same year or the very following year, we don't really get a lot of information. Would it be better if we change that law eventually to maybe 2 years so that we would have a little bit more information to look at and it will kind of free up the auditor's time?
I agree. A lot of times we pass stuff and the way it goes into, act, goes in July. A lot of times we don't even get, the first year. And it would be better if we waited until the second year, I think, to audit something. Even like Apex, you're really not going to get much first year. I mean, second year, you'll at least start to get some detail. And no, I think that might be a good piece of legislation for us to look at. So,
Thank you.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, a moment ago, Kristen presented the newly created incentives memo, and it's primarily just a description on the first year because there's not much activity to review because it's so new.
Okay, further questions? Representative Burrows? Not seeing any. We do need a motion on this. Do I have a motion? Representative Barker makes the motion. Representative Burrows seconds. Any questions or comments? All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Against, nay. Passes. Motion's approved. Okay, I think we're at a stop. We're going to take a few-minute break here, and we'll pick up about 10:15. I think we've got a couple members that this is their last meeting. Representative Barker, I've served with for several years on this, and he was my counterpart in Fed State, which I enjoyed very much. And then Representative Burrows, you've been on this committee since they developed it probably. But I served with him in the House, and you two have given us done a fine job and kept the historical knowledge here, and we're going to miss that over the next few years of all the things you guys know and done. So, Chris, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If both of you would like to open your gifts, we just wanted to recognize your longstanding service on the committee for both of you. Representative Burrows, 20 years on the committee by our count. You've been through a number of post-audit tours, but we appreciate your service. You've been a big fan of our work, and you seem to understand what we do, and we appreciate that very much. And Representative Barker as well, 10 years by our count, again, through several different staff leadership changes on the committee. Again, thank you for your dedication to our committee and your thoughtful input and your support over the years. And we just have a little something for you in recognition. There is now coffee, and there are cupcakes, chocolate, lemon, and the cinnamon rolls are gluten-free if anyone is gluten-free. So enjoy.
Thank you.
When we come back after break, we'll have executive session. Go ahead,
Oh, I'm just going to make a comment. This is one of the best committees I've served on in my entire 10 years in the legislature. I think I've chaired it twice or three times. Tom's been my ranking member, and I've always liked this committee because it is basically, what I think, Tom, and I would agree, we've tried to keep this nonpartisan. It's a nonpartisan committee. We look at these audits. It's unfortunate, I don't think in the 20 years you've served on it, you were ever in the majority, so you didn't get to be chairman, but you were a ranking member many, many times. And I want to thank the committee, the staff. I've had 3 post-auditors. Chris, because you're here, you're the best. But with that, I'll turn it over to my distinguished colleague.
Representative Burrows, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This by far has been my most favorite committee. Even when I was in leadership, I stayed on this committee. I've learned so much. And one thing I would like to say is how proud of the post-audit team I am, because over the years, the politics that gets played sometimes in the process that we do, you've always been able to rise above it and present the information and the data as requested. And I commend each and every one of you. I'm a better legislator because of the reports you've put out. And I sincerely appreciate your work and your commitment to good government, efficient government, and the transparency that we rely on in government. And to my colleagues and friends, it's been a great ride. I've enjoyed my legislative time here, and as I stated, this is my favorite committee, and I think I don't want to say I've grown old with some of you, but I've been here for a long time, and I'm going to miss each and every one of you. And to those that I haven't become close to, that's on me, because we all get busy, but I value each and every one of you and wish you nothing but the very best life has to offer. And thank you for the opportunity to serve with such an esteemed group of people. Thank you.
I just want to say, as chair, I mean, it's an honor to serve with these guys. I mean, I've served a lot of years, some in the House with you, and you know, working with John on conference committees and et cetera. You know, you've always supported trying to help me with the agenda, and I appreciate all your effort, and we're going to miss your guys' knowledge and historical knowledge. But I wish you the best in the future. Thank you. We'll take a little break, and we'll come right back. Come back, and we're going to move into executive session. I believe we have a motion. Representative Barker?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to recess this open meeting for a closed meeting pursuant to KSA 754319, parentheses A, to discuss matters relating to security measures that protect the University of Kansas Medical Center under the jurisdiction listed in KSA 754319, parentheses B, parentheses 12, parentheses C, because discussion of such matters in an open meeting would jeopardize such security measures, and to resume the open meeting in room 546 at
What time?
10:30. 10:35.
So got a little more to.
And record this motion if adopted as part of the committee permanent record.
Okay, do I have a second? Pearl, second. Any questions, comments? All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Against nay, passes. We're in executive session, so if everybody turn 25 minutes, right? Okay. Are we up? Okay, we're back in open session. I believe Representative Burrows, you have a motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move to recess this open meeting for a closed meeting pursuant to KSA 75-4319A to discuss matters relating to the annual evaluation of the post auditor under the justification listed in KSA 75-4319B1, because such evaluation constitutes a need to discuss a personnel matter of non-elected personnel, to resume the open meeting in room 546 at, you said 25? 11 a.m., and to record this motion if adopted in the minutes as part of the committee's permanent records.
Have a motion, to have a second? Representative Barker seconds it. Questions or comments? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Against nay? It passes. We're going into executive session. We're back in regular session. I'll let you go ahead and get everything online. Okay. We're back online. We just got done reviewing our legislative post-auditor, and I just want to personally say that it was outstanding, and she's done a really good job, and you know, the committee appreciates all the work that Chris, you're doing, and the staff, and just excellent work. Can't say much more than just you're doing an outstanding job. So we'll move on to the 10-year audit plan. Chris, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is tab D in your notebook. This is the Triennial Audit Plan. State law requires that we conduct audit work at each state agency at least once every 3 years. Kansas currently has more than 75 individual state agencies. So that's a challenge. We plan to meet this requirement in three basic ways. First, through our IT security audits, mostly because that work includes a survey of all state agencies to help us evaluate how much sensitive data they maintain. We use this information to evaluate their risk, and then our IT audits of specific agencies evaluate specific security practices. During a 3-year period, we estimate these audits will cover from 16 to 75 state agencies, depending on which option you choose, and you're going to be presented an option here, the next item, or in an item or two on the agenda. Another way we meet the requirement to conduct work at each state agency every 3 years is through data mining, analysis, and follow-up. As part of that work, we use a variety of analytical techniques to review all agency credit card transactions. And then we follow through with agency officials on questionable transactions to determine whether they represent fraud, abuse, or waste. Our plan will also be discussed in that area more fully in a minute. And then finally, through our performance audit work, during a 3-year period, we estimate we conduct roughly about 40 performance audits. And although we can't estimate how much additional audit coverage this work will provide on an agency basis, it helps us increase our audit coverage statewide. So that is our 3-year plan and how we plan to do at least a smidge of audit work at every state agency over that 3-year period.
Okay. Questions for Chris? Not seeing any. We need a motion to approve. Do I have a motion? Okay, Representative Barker makes a motion. Representative Burrows seconds. Any questions or comments? Not seeing any. All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Against nay, passes. Okay, we'll move on to the annual IT security plan. Katrina?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I will walk you through the 2023 IT security audit plan next. That memo is in your notebooks in tab E. So earlier you have heard our 3-year IT summary report, as well as a presentation on KUMC in the executive session. So we conduct these IT audits under KSA 463511. Under committee rules, we also conduct a statewide risk assessment every 3 years to determine what state agencies carry the highest risks based on the sensitive data that they deal with. So based on the risk assessment and other factors, we provide you an annual plan for agencies that we propose for auditing in the next year. So in 2023, we actually have 2 options in front of you. Under option A, we would continue conducting comprehensive IT security audits on about 6 entities using our confidential report format that you're familiar with. So as you heard earlier, these audits are fairly detailed. They cover about 9 or so areas, and they evaluate roughly 45 controlled items each. Given the staff resources, we hope to conduct between 6 and 8 audits during that calendar year. So those audit results are confidential, like you've heard one today, and then again, every 3 years, we do summarize it for public. Under this option, we would also continue adding a school district to the mix of every 4 agencies that we audit. This has been the committee's direction in the past 2 years, but it's certainly something that you could change. So again, under this option, we would essentially continue our work as we have in the past 3 years. The memo lists the entities we propose to audit, and that includes the primary candidates as well as some backups. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about option B. That one is in your memo as well. We would conduct more limited IT security audits for multiple agencies at the same time. This would produce a public report, maybe 2 a year, maybe 3, depending on how things go. So each audit would focus on a very limited number of areas, so maybe 1 or 2 areas, and just a few control items per audit. But we do that, or that would be the proposal, because we would cover more agencies at the same time, so between 10 and 15 agencies per audit. And by batching multiple agencies, we would be able to report out publicly how those 8 entities did as a group for limited control items like I've talked about. So with option B, just to reiterate, we would ask the committee to also clarify whether school districts should be included or excluded. And as part of the proposal with the A and B option, there are some detailed proposals attached to the memo that you can see. They differ just slightly to enumerate the issues or the differences in options. And with that, I stand for questions.
Do we have questions? Representative Barker?
Attachment B, is this a staff, did you have a discussion, Chris, or looking at another option of what you're doing now, or how did this come about?
Right. Yeah, well, we wanted to put this in front of you. Again, we just finished a 3-year period, and we thought it might be a good way for you to kind of reinsert yourself in the process. We have done the same thing. It works beautiful. It works great. But obviously, one of the pitfalls with option A, our continued audits of individual agencies, is actually 2 of them. One of them is the information is private. It does not necessarily see the light of day, so there's maybe a little bit less accountability. The second issue really has to do with the breadth of agencies that we get to. And so we wanted to put this in front of you. Obviously, when we audit under the regular circumstances, option A, we take a look at the high-risk agencies. So you're going to see the same agencies, every 3 or 4 years.
And with option B, it would vary, but you did indicate, or I think you stated, we would have an option about adding school districts in?
Certainly.
How many school districts would we?
I think the max, again, for the public option, option B, we would do maybe 10, 12, 15 agencies at a max in one audit. And that, would include school districts, again, depending on what you want.
Thank you.
Okay. Further questions? Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. With regard to the more limited but more broad number, what would we be losing anything on security, or it sounds like you just focus on the areas, vulnerability scans, passwords, things like that. I guess, I like the deep dive on the audits, but there's an appeal to having A, the public component, and B, looking at more and the public accountability, which to me is kind of appealing. Maybe we do. Is it an either or can we do a hybrid? A fewer number of the deep dives, and then include, a broader, short IT security scan?
So thank you, Senator, for that question. Hybrids make it even harder to plan, so I would caution you going that route, because just work papers and just how we set things up, it would make it a little bit harder for us to do. It's certainly doable if that's what you would like to do. But you're exactly right. The pros in option A are also the cons for option B and vice versa. So I've talked a little bit about why we are giving you option B. Obviously, I would remiss to tell you that under option A, obviously the details and the richness is the good part about that. And then also under option A, you have a better understanding of an agency's true IT security posture. The problem with option B is if you're just, dipping your toe into a couple of IT security notions, an agency could come back and say, yeah, but we're really good over here, so they could make the argument that they're still really good, comprehensively, having a few holes on this side, is covered over here, which we would not audit, and we wouldn't be able to, speak about that.
Representative Burrows?
Thank you. Well, with option B, if we were to identify that there was an issue with a particular agency, or that we would be able to come back and request a full audit or a more in-depth audit. I would assume that would be an option that we would have if we just went with B.
To clarify option B, we would talk about as a whole. So we would not necessarily say, okay, in this audit, we have 10 agencies. These 5 do terrible, these do really well. So we wouldn't necessarily give you the information about it by agency.
We couldn't get that information personally as members?
We could, and in the past, just to remind you, back in 2012, 2014, we did something like that in option, like the option B, which is again why we're bringing it forward. In that time frame, we actually did a public report as well as individual confidential reports. That is also an option. It does speak to the notion of, just more process. And more process also means less audit work, which could mean less results.
Representative Barker?
Representative Burrows hit my question exactly. If you see smoke, then you could ask for a more in-depth audit in April. But it just seems like we're going to cover a wider area. You throw your nut out, you're liable to find a few other things out there. If you look at more agencies, and I like the aspect of adding the schools to it.
Well, these take time, so, and, if we need to broaden the net, nothing happens on this committee like overnight. Unless it needs to, so we'll have plenty of time to make the decision and add it to a broader audit. So, further questions or comments? Not seeing any. Thank you. Let's go ahead and move on to the annual IT monitoring plan.
Actually, I'm going to stick with this for a little bit because I think we do need a motion. Our year is coming to an end, and we do need to start planning for the next year. So it is important for us to understand which road you're going to go to.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to move a motion that we adopt attachment B, cast a larger net.
Okay. Got a second? Any questions or comments? All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Oh, do you have a comment?
Just want to clarify, maybe if you could speak to schools in or out.
To include the schools. To include the schools. My motion would be modified to include the schools.
Second. Everybody happy? Senator Thompson?
Yeah, I like this. I really think it does. It does cast a broader net, and then it does help us identify more potential problems, and then we can do the deep dive. And, at some later date, it's not working, we flip back. Makes sense to me.
Okay, we've discussed, go ahead, Senator Ware.
Yeah, I'd like to make sure, as we're thinking about this, that we, expanding more audits, we do more than one school district in how we include it. Because the school districts have seemed to be some that might be more benefited from this information than some other of our agencies that we look at.
Okay.
So I would have another option for you, because in that Plan B, so to speak, we do anticipate 2 public audits in the year. We could do one simply on state agencies and the second one on schools, or we could mix it up with a 4-to-1 ratio that you had previously chosen. So in a 4-to-1 ratio with maybe 12 audits, we would do 3 school districts and the rest of them, 3 or 4 school districts, and then the rest of them agencies. So whatever your pleasure.
Okay. We got a motion, but
I'll modify my motion to what she said. 4-to-1. That way we would get 4 school districts.
4 school districts,
And
8
then-
state agencies per audit.
do you accept that as a
I do. I just want to make sure that we follow the proper procedure for,
Thank you.
On the motion in a second.
You've amended the motion
I've
in a
amended my
second,
motion
like,
to include.
a couple times, but
4-to-1.
it's doable. Any other questions or comments? Not seeing any. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Against, nay. Passes. Okay, we'll move on to the annual IT monitoring plan.
And I'm still here. All right. So thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I will walk you through the annual IT monitoring plan for calendar year 2023 next. That memo is in your notebooks on tab F. State law requires us to monitor ongoing IT projects to identify signs that a project is at risk of failure. Additionally, committee rules require us to do an annual risk assessment of all IT projects reported to the Kansas Information Technology Office. We did conduct this risk assessment in October this year, based on the available quarterly report at that time. We do recommend that we continue to monitor the Kansas Bureau of Investigation's automated biometrics identification system, or ABIS for short. The ABIS system is a project that is one of the 19 active projects that is being reported to KEDO. We have been following this project for the last 2 years. It is currently scheduled for completion next fall, and the project has started showing signs of scheduling issues, so it's definitely worth making sure we have our eyeballs on this one. And again, because of vacancies our IT team has had throughout 2022, we do not recommend additional or new project monitoring at this time. And with that, I stand for questions.
Okay, questions? Okay, no questions. We do need a motion. Okay, Representative Barker makes a motion. Representative Burrows seconds. Any questions or comments? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Against, nay? Passes. Okay, we'll move on. Planning the legislative report meeting. Chris, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee rule requires us to identify which audits are of particular relevance to standing legislative committees. The rule further requires that we offer to meet with the chair, vice chair, and ranking minority of each such committee, and that we share our proposed meeting schedule with you guys. And just so you know, we present a summary of our audit work to the House Appropriations and Senate Ways and Means Committees early in the session, so they are not on our list. I'm in tab F, is that where I am? G, I'm sorry, I'm in tab G. So it's a one-page memo that summarizes our planned committees for the audits that were most relevant this past year. The first one, I apologize, please change the date, the economic development evaluations of major commerce programs. We hope to have that for you today. That will be January 2023, but otherwise we would still meet with those committees pretty early on. It'll be the first meeting in January. We plan Senate Assessment and Tax, Senate Commerce, House Commerce, Labor, Eco-Development, and House Tax. For COVID relief funding distribution that was released in September, we plan Senate, Federal and State, and House Fed and State. For virtual school expenditures, that was also released in September, we plan Senate Ed, House Ed, and House K-12 education budget. For cryptocurrency, that was a limited scope audit released in July. We plan to meet with Senate Assessment and Tax, Senate Fed and State, House Fed and State, and House Tax. Foster care was released back in March. For that one, Senate Public Health and Welfare, House Children and Seniors, and the Joint Committee on Child Welfare System Oversight. And finally, industrial revenue bonds, property tax exemptions. Plan to meet with Senate Assessment and Tax, Senate Commerce, House Commerce, Labor, and Economic Development, and House Tax. I'd welcome any additions or other suggestions you may have.
Questions? Representative Burrows?
Thank you. In reference to the cryptocurrency, has this ever appeared before the House or Senate Financial Institutions Committee?
I think we talked about it about 8 years ago when I was chair or so. We had in our informational days, we just kind of scratched the dirt. Tom Hawk, we kind of joked about it, but I think, this was mine, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is something I've always felt, I know at different levels of the government, they're taking different kinds of pay, we'll say it like that, and I think we need to look into this way more, especially after what has happened with the fraud net. I've always felt like, you know, my banking hat, that's a place where there could be a lot of fraud. So I don't know if that helps explain that or
Well,
not.
if we're going to have that conversation with cryptocurrency, Mr. Chairman, I think some new members may benefit from some of the history associated to that. And I didn't know if financial institutions would be one that we would want to start that conversation with. That's the only suggestion, recommendation, or even a comment I would have is the financial institutions. I think they're going to be observing and watching and maybe come forward with some policies also.
I think that'd be very good. I think part of it was, I wanted to know, was other states using cryptocurrency, you know, for pay taxes and different things. I don't know if we went in that far. I don't remember how we wrote the audit, but, you know, we need to start talking about this in a big way in our state. But I agree. I think it would probably land in FI&I on our side and financial institutions on your side. And so,
I will add that to the list.
other questions or comments? It's good discussion. I'd take it in Fed and State. We handle everything in Fed and State. Further questions? Not seeing any? We'll move on. Let me flip the page here. You know, this is going to be a little different, but I'm going to pass the chair to my colleague here, since he spent 20 years on this committee. Let him chair the last few items.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's very nice of you. Thank you. So we're talking, we're going to data mining results. Is that where we are? So I recognize Matt to present the results.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm going to be going over the results of our data mining work from this last year, looking into the state's TANF program. You'll find our memo in, I believe, the sleeve of your notebooks. It'll have my name attached to it entitled Results of LPA Data Mining. Just for a little bit of background, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, commonly referred to as TANF, is a federally funded program that provides financial assistance to Kansas families. Those benefits are loaded onto electronic benefit cards, commonly called EBT cards. Recipients can spend their TANF benefits on things like groceries, supplies, or rent, but they are prohibited from using their benefits at certain places like liquor stores, casinos, or gaming establishments. So with that in mind, our data mining team reviewed the state's 2021 TANF data to look for cases of fraud or potential misuse. First, we reviewed about 300,000 TANF transactions to see whether they were allowable under those federal rules. So of those 300,000 transactions, about 257,000 were point-of-sale transactions, which all did appear to be appropriate. We also found about 42,000 of those 300,000 transactions were ATM withdrawals. So federal policy does allow TANF recipients to withdraw cash to help pay for things in certain situations. But in those situations, we couldn't determine whether recipients spent their benefits on allowable items or not. And of course, that's because there is no digital trail for us to follow once the money's been withdrawn from the ATM. For a little bit of context, those ATM withdrawals accounted for about 40%, or about 6.2 million of the roughly 14.9 million in TANF transactions that we reviewed in 2021. We also reviewed the location of those 300,000 transactions. So state law does prohibit recipients from making out-of-state point-of-sale transactions, which our review did not find any evidence of. We did find about 3,300 out-of-state ATM withdrawals, though, totaling about $467,000. So again, for a little bit of context, that accounts for about 8% of all of those ATM transactions that I was talking about in 2021. So for example, we found one recipient withdrew about $1,000 from an ATM in Florida. We found another withdrawal for about $240 made in Nevada. That being said, a review of state law, it doesn't appear state law explicitly prohibits ATM withdrawals in other states. It's just point of sale transactions in other states. So that was just something that we found and just wanted to bring to the attention of DCF for their consideration. We also look for cases of imposter fraud, which of course that happens when a fraudster uses personal information to illegally apply for benefits in other people's names. To do that, we reviewed TANF application data for about 79,000 TANF applications in 2021. We looked at the data for things like duplicated email addresses, duplicated residential mailing address, duplicated names, date of birth, those sort of things. Like audits we've done in the past, you know, those duplicates, we see a lot of duplicates between different unique applications. That's a pretty good indicator to us that imposter fraud might be happening. But in this case, initially we found about 450 applications that kind of threw up some red flags for us. We're a little bit suspicious, but we're able to work with DCF on those to be able to provide a reasonable explanation on those 450. So we ultimately didn't find any evidence of any kind of widespread imposter fraud within the TANF program. That being said, of course, this wasn't a detailed forensic audit. It was just our high-level review. So with that being said, that concludes our data mining team work on the TANF program. As Chris mentioned before, we do plan to continue our review of state agency credit card transactions going forward into 2023. So we would be looking at fiscal year 2022 P card transactions for any state agency that had a P card and used it in fiscal year 2022. And like we've done in the past, we'll use different data analytical techniques, risk scoring techniques, and those sort of things to try to flag suspicious P card transactions. And then any that kind of rise to the top in terms of risk scoring, then we'd work with those individual state agencies to do follow-up, get supporting documentation, try to understand so what's the rationale or explanation for anything that we see that's suspicious, and then maybe work with them to try to evaluate some of their internal controls that might help prevent fraud, waste, or abuse within their P card programs going forward. So we will start that process very quickly here in January by starting that risk scoring across all state agencies. That's a quick summary, an update on our data mining work this last year and where we plan on going next year. Happy to stand for any questions that the committee might have on our data mining work.
Thank you, Matt. We do have a question. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What Matt, do you have a total number of dollars on the total, or Mr. Vice Chair or whatever, temporary chair? Do you have I didn't see a total number of money transactions, so I could, do you have that?
So in 2021, it was about $14.9 million in total.
$14.9 million, okay. And one other follow, if I may. Do other states also allow ATM transactions, or are there any states that prohibit that? Because money is fungible. You're not supposed to take it to a casino or a liquor store, but you go to an ATM, you draw it out, and then you go do what you want to do.
So that, we didn't specifically look at other state policies, but I will say that that is a federal regulation that states should try to make TANF benefits as accessible as possible when it comes to ATM withdrawals. So not putting like daily limits in terms of, being overly restrictive in terms of how much cash they can. So the federal government has encouraged states to try to be as open as possible. Accessible as
And of course, we also have to protect the taxpayer's dollar, and which to me is, if we're going to help people and then they're turning around and buying lottery tickets or buying liquor or whatever else, then we're not being responsible for the taxpayer's dollar. So I think it's something we ought to look for, even though the federal government encourages, quote unquote. I think it's something to look at. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Thank you.
Senator Ware?
Yeah, so our findings that we were hearing about today is that there really aren't too awful many instances of fraud. Is that correct?
I would say we didn't find any issues with, potential fraudulent No, the ATM withdrawals that we highlighted, there's nothing prohibiting that in state law, but no, we didn't find any cases of.
Right, and early, I'd heard, perhaps we made some changes before I was in the legislature. People were having trouble getting enough money on a day, there was a daily limit or something that some kind of limitation that way, so that they would have to anticipate 3 days in a row going to the ATM to get enough money to pay rent, for instance. That's just, when someone doesn't have resources, that's the last thing we should be asking them to do. So I agree that that's probably the way to do it, is what we're doing. And that, so it was good to hear, though, that the fraud is minimal, if at all. Thank you.
Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really, it looks like about 8%, so it's pretty minimal. I think these are all trackable transactions, so if you're out of state or wherever you're doing it. I think if I remember right, back in maybe 2014 or 15, I don't remember if we had a limit on it or they couldn't use it out of state or there were some controls put on. They seemed to be overburdensome, and I believe we took them back off, but I could be wrong. It was quite a lengthy debate when we put that on or attempted to. I think this just proves that, there's no fraud. Everybody's working inside the rules. We do have some people that are out of state. I mean, that are, but that could happen in, go from Kansas to Kansas City, Missouri. People go see family or whatever, and so I think it's within range. I mean, so that's just my thing.
Any other questions, comments? Matt, thank you. And I would just state that this issue has been one that's been on many legislators' table for a number of years and has had a lot of discussion. But I think it's a program that is necessary in our state, and the audit shows that everything's working as it should be working. It's a program of need, but the audit shows that there's very little, if any, fraud at all. And I think that's a compliment to the legislature's oversight. And this isn't an actionable item, is it?
No, members from the DCF are here, and if you have questions, they'll answer.
Are there any DCF people that want to speak? Any questions of our DCF? Seeing none. Okay, thank you. Nobody wants to ask, okay. Thank you. Is there a comment you'd want to make? Okay, great. All right, thank you, Matt. Thank you, committee. Matt, I think you're next on an audit recommendation report to legislative post-audit rule 3 through 5.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a pretty quick update on our audit recommendation report. So just as a reminder, twice a year we work with state agencies that have audit recommendations that are between 6 months and 2 years old. We basically work with the agency, ask them if they are still planning on implementing our recommendations, where they're at in that process, and then try to give us a little bit of a description in terms of where they are in implementing our recommendations. So all the information is now updated on our website. We finished our second update session of the year, basically. So you all should have gotten an email last week with a link to our website and that status report that will show whether or not agencies have implemented our recommendation, are in the process of implementing, or have declined to implement, and then a brief narrative summary of where they stand in that process. So just wanted to make sure that that got called to everyone's attention, and then also happy to answer any questions that you all might have about our audit recommendation follow-up process or agency's status in that.
Committee, any questions? Your last chance to question Matt. Seeing none. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Next on the agenda is Chris to discuss the date of the next committee meeting.
Thank you, Representative Burrows. Okay, there's a little summary of the next anticipated meeting dates in your packet. It's the last tab. The chair has tentatively, get your calendars out, he's tentatively set a meeting date for January 18th. That is a Wednesday at noon. At that meeting, we will receive the economic development evaluation of major programs that we had hoped to have today, but that one will be January 18th. And then statutorily, the committee is required to meet and re-elect new leadership at the start of the session, so that will happen that meeting as well. So we're looking at January 18th for economic development programs and committee reorganization. And then statute also requires the Department of Commerce to come present a report to this committee at the end of January every year. So we have tentatively set that date for January 25th. That is also a Wednesday at noon. After that, there's no specific dates, but audit work that is currently underway. We're looking at a release date of February for groundwater management, child support enforcement, and election security part 1. We are going to break that into 2 reports because we have part of it ready. Then coming up in May will be the remainder of election security. And TBD, because we haven't started these audits yet, we have 3 from last year that we haven't started yet, but we will. Community college athletics, working from home, and the follow-up audit. I'd be happy to stand for any questions about any of those dates or reports.
Committee, any questions? Senator Thompson?
Thanks, sir. You said, I missed one. We're doing the 18th. We're also having a meeting on the 25th. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then the other dates are tentative yet? Okay.
Yes.
Thanks, Chris.
Right.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Seeing that, Chris, I will not be making the January meeting.
Yes, we will have new committee members to replace our departing members. So that first meeting on the 18th is where everyone will meet and greet and elect new leadership. It will go to the House side this year, or next year. So the committee members vote a new chair, a new vice chair, and a new ranking minority.
Thank you, Chris. That brings us to the end of our agenda, the end of our meeting, and I'm going to take Chairman's privilege and ask my colleague, Mr. Barker, Representative Barker, you have any comments you want to make before we adjourn?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad the former chairman appointed you to represent the last part of this meeting. No, I just want to thank the entire staff. They've just been excellent. They've been great to work with. We know we've had changes, and we've never really missed a beat when we've changed leadership, and they're to be complimented. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd just like to say how much I respect the professional courtesy, Senator Olson, Mr. Chairman, to allow me to chair the last half of the committee. It means a lot that you would do that. Thank you. And that's to my other colleagues, friendships and relationships are very important in this process. Your personal integrity is what allows you to be the successes you are in the legislature. It's been my privilege to serve with each and every one of you, as I stated earlier. Mr. Barker and Mr. Olson, you two have been not only good colleagues, but just good friends throughout the process. And I appreciate the opportunity to work with each and every one of you and staff. Thank you for everything, and to everyone, Merry Christmas and have a happy holiday, and I'd entertain a motion for adjournment. Motion by Representative Barker, second by Senator Olson. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, like sign. Seeing none, we are adjourned.